In 2023, a team of scientists published a study in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. They had analyzed the DNA of over 3,000 living people from 50 populations across the planet. And buried inside that data, they found something that nobody had a clean explanation for. A moment in human history, nearly 1 million years ago, when the entire ancestral line of our species collapsed to approximately 1,200 individuals. Not 12,000, not 12 million, 1,200. 98.7% of our ancestors were gone. The human story almost ended before it began. The scientists named it a bottleneck. They described the cause as unknown. What they did not say, because it was not their job to say it, is that the basic structure of what they found, a catastrophic reduction, a tiny surviving group, a world rebuilt from almost nothing, is the oldest story in the Bible. And that is just where this gets started. There is a story so old that nearly every civilization on Earth has told a version of it. A man, a boat, a flood that swallows the world. Animals carried 2 by 2 through rising waters. A mountain where everything stops and silence, and then the slow return of dry land and the beginning of everything again. You know this story. Most people think they know what it is. A religious myth, a moral lesson, an ancient metaphor dressed up in the language of water and wood and divine judgment. What almost nobody expects is what happens when you take that story seriously. Not as theology, not as literature, as a question. What if the flood account in Genesis is not a borrowed legend, not a fairy tale, not a metaphor? What if it is a memory, a biological memory, written not in clay tablets, but in the human genome itself? Because when geneticists started asking a completely different set of questions about human ancestry, they found something they were not looking for. And what they found keeps connecting in ways that are difficult to dismiss to the oldest survival story ever told. If this is the kind of question that makes you stop and actually think, there are more of them coming on this channel. Following takes 2 seconds, and it means you will not miss what comes next. Start with the genetics, because that is where the trail begins. The human mitochondrial genome is a small loop of DNA, roughly 16,500 base pairs, passed from mother to child, with almost no mixing from the father's side. It mutates slowly, predictably, at rates that scientists have spent decades calibrating. Because of this, it functions as a clock. The further back you trace it, the deeper into human ancestry you go. What researchers discovered mapping this clock across thousands of living people from every corner of the planet is that the entire mitochondrial diversity of the modern human species converges on a surprisingly small number of foundational lineages. Geneticists have catalogued these as haplogroups, broad genetic families defined by shared mutation clusters. And at the deepest level, before the branches divide into the diversity we see today, the whole tree resolves into a remarkably narrow trunk. Scientists label the 3 primary lineages M, N, and R. 3 major lines, 3 ancestral mothers. The entire living human population on Earth traces back through the maternal line to women who carried these 3 mitochondrial signatures. Not 100 women, not 1,000. 3 foundational lines, and from those lines all of us. That finding alone would be extraordinary. But the Y chromosome tells a companion story that is, in some ways, even more striking. The Y chromosome passes directly from father to son, almost unchanged across generations, except for the mutations that accumulate at a known rate. When researchers mapped the Y chromosome diversity of men from every population on Earth, they found something parallel to the mitochondrial data, but with an additional layer of strangeness. The diversity in Y chromosome lineages across all of humanity is considerably lower than what you would expect from a species of our size and age. There are essentially no highly ancient, deeply divergent Y chromosome lineages anywhere on Earth. The tree is shallow, the trunk is narrow. Whatever happened to human male lineages at some point in the deep past resulted in a compression that the genetics still reflects today. The Y chromosomes of men in sub-Saharan Africa, in East Asia, in the Pacific Islands, in the Americas, all trace back through branches that converge in a time window that is, in evolutionary terms, extremely recent. Every man alive on Earth today carries a Y chromosome that connects back to a single paternal ancestor, shared by the entire species. Those two facts, one foundational Y chromosome lineage and three foundational mitochondrial lineages, form the genetic architecture that underlies the entire living human family, and they were sitting in the data waiting to be found long before anyone went looking for a biblical connection. The connection appeared not because someone set out to confirm scripture, but because the numbers kept pointing in directions that demanded explanation. Now step back from the genetics for a moment and consider what the story in Genesis actually describes. 8 people, 4 men, 4 women, 3 of the men the sons of one father. A catastrophic event that eliminates the prior population, and from those 8, the repopulation of an entire world. If you were trying to model what the genetic signature of that kind of event would look like thousands of years later, you would predict exactly what the data shows. A single Y chromosome lineage, because all the men came from one paternal line. 3 mitochondrial lineages, because there were 4 women, and one of the 4, Noah's wife, shared her mitochondrial line with her husband's lineage in a way that could collapse down to 3 surviving distinct female lines. The mathematics of it are not comfortable for people who would prefer that science and scripture remain in separate rooms, but the mathematics does not particularly care about that preference. This is not, to be completely clear, a straightforward proof of anything. Science does not work by confirming ancient texts. What the genetic data does is describe a set of observations that require explanation, and several of those observations fit the Genesis account in ways that are genuinely strange to dismiss as coincidence. What it suggests, at minimum, is that whoever wrote Genesis was either working from memories of something real or arrived at a description of human origins that turns out to be remarkably consistent with what the genome reveals. Neither of those possibilities is trivial. The question of the flood itself is where things become even more interesting and considerably more complicated. A global flood covering every mountain on Earth is, from a physical standpoint, not something the geological or hydrological record supports. The water simply does not exist. There is not enough water in the atmosphere, the oceans, or locked in ice to submerge the Himalayas, the Andes, or the Rockies. That conclusion is not controversial among geologists. What is more complicated is the question of whether a catastrophic regional flood, one large enough to destroy every human community within its reach, one that to the people experiencing it would have felt like the end of the entire world, could have occurred in the right time and place to serve as the origin point for the Genesis narrative. And there the evidence is considerably more interesting. In the early 1990s, 2 marine geologists named William Ryan and Walter Pittman were studying sediment cores from the Black Sea floor. What they found in those cores was a layer of marine fossils sharply interrupting a layer of freshwater sediment. The transition was abrupt. Below a certain depth, the sediment told the story of a freshwater lake. Above it, saltwater ocean. The line between them was not gradual. It was sudden. Ryan and Pittman proposed a hypothesis that has been debated, refined, and substantially supported in the decades since. Around 7,500 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, sea levels in the Mediterranean were rising as glaciers melted. The natural dam separating the Black Sea basin from the Mediterranean was a ridge of land in what is now the Bosphorus Strait. When that barrier finally gave way, the Mediterranean did not trickle gently into the Black Sea. The water cascaded through with a force geologist's estimate was roughly 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls every day for months. The Black Sea basin, which had been a large freshwater lake ringed by human settlements, filled with salt water. The shoreline expanded by hundreds of miles. Everything along the former lakeside was gone. The communities that had existed there for generations, the fishing villages, the agricultural settlements, the people who had built lives on those shores, were swept away or driven inland in a catastrophe of a scale that no individual human being alive at that moment could have comprehended as anything other than the end of the world. The people who survived did not stay silent. They carried what they had witnessed with them in the only medium available to them, which was language, story, and memory. They moved outward into the Middle East, into the Caucasus, into the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where they told their children what had happened, and their children told theirs. The story compressed and intensified as it traveled, as stories always do. What had been a regional catastrophe became, in memory, a flood that covered everything, because for the people who experienced it, it had. The local horizon was their entire known world. The water that destroyed it was, from where they stood, the end of all things. The timing of the Black Sea deluge places it squarely within the window of early Mesopotamian civilization. The people of Sumer and Akkad were the inheritors of a world reshaped by that event. Their flood myths, and they had several, were not invented from nothing. They were distillations of memory. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which contains the story of Utnapishtim and the Great Flood, which scholars have known for over a century, shares its basic structure with the Genesis account, was not composed as fiction. It was composed as the written preservation of something that people across the Fertile Crescent already knew, already told, already handed down to their children as a true account of how their world had almost ended. The biblical account is the Israelite version of that same tradition, told with a different theology and a different understanding of why the flood happened, but connected by a thread that runs back to the same catastrophic event. And here is the detail that tends to stop people cold. The similarities between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis account are not vague thematic parallels. They are structural. In both stories, a man is warned by a divine source that a catastrophic flood is coming. In both, he builds a large vessel to preserve life. In both, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain. In both, the survivor releases birds to test whether the waters have receded. The Gilgamesh version sends a dove, a swallow, and a raven. Genesis sends the same birds in the same sequence. When George Smith, an assistant at the British Museum, first translated the relevant clay tablet from ancient Nineveh in 1872 and recognized the structural overlap with Genesis, the discovery was significant enough to make international news. People understood immediately what it meant. This was not one culture inventing a story in isolation. This was multiple cultures, separated by centuries and geography, all preserving the same event. If what you are hearing right now is changing how you think about this story, hit the like button. It actually matters more than most people realize, for getting this kind of content in front of people who have never thought about these questions before. What the genetics adds to this picture is not a simple confirmation. It is a complication that is more interesting than a confirmation. Because the genetic data is not just pointing at a regional Bronze Age flood. The human population bottleneck that the mitochondrial and Y chromosome data describe is real. And geneticists have identified multiple layers of it at different points in human history. The deepest and most severe is not 7,500 years old. The 2023 study in Science, using a novel modeling technique applied to the genomes of over 3,000 living people from 50 populations worldwide, identified a profound human population bottleneck occurring between approximately 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. The population of human ancestors during that period collapsed from perhaps 100,000 individuals to roughly 1,200 breeding individuals. 1,200. The entire ancestral line from which every human being alive today descends was reduced for approximately 117,000 years to a group of people so small that any plausible scenario of ancient tribal life could have carried them all in a single valley. An estimated 98.7% of the human lineage was wiped out. The researchers describe it as the closest our species has ever come to extinction. The cause is unknown. The event left no confirmed name in any record because there was no writing, no civilization, no memory-making apparatus sophisticated enough to capture and preserve what happened. Only the DNA remembers. That finding is sitting there in the scientific literature, entirely disconnected from theology, published in one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed journals in the world, describing a moment in deep human history that mirrors, in its basic outline, the structure of the Genesis account. A catastrophic reduction, a tiny surviving population, the gradual repopulation of the world from those few survivors. The genomic fingerprint of that ancient survival is written into every human being alive. You carry it. Every person you have ever met carries it. The signature of a near-extinction event that happened almost 1,000,000 years ago is embedded in your cells right now. As you listen to this, silent and invisible and as real as anything in your body. Now, there is a responsible point to make here. The bottleneck identified in the 2023 study is far older than any event the Genesis text could plausibly be describing. The Genesis account is set in a recognizably human world, with agriculture and animal husbandry and the building of boats. That is a Holocene story, not a Pleistocene one. The ancient bottleneck and the Genesis narrative are not describing the same event, but what the ancient bottleneck reveals is something that should recalibrate how we think about the Noah story and stories like it. The human genome preserves the record of catastrophic survival events. It has done this before, almost 1,000,000 years ago, and the signature is still there. If a significant enough regional catastrophe reduced a founding population to a small enough number, if the Black Sea flood or an event like it was severe enough and hit the right population at the right time, the genetics of modern humans would reflect it. The question of whether any such reflection exists in the 5,000 to 10,000 year range, the period consistent with a late Neolithic or early Bronze Age catastrophic flood in the Near East, is exactly the kind of question that population geneticists are increasingly equipped to investigate. And there is something in the data worth noting. Studies of the male Y chromosome lineage have identified what researchers describe as a pronounced compression in Y chromosome diversity occurring approximately 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. The compression is asymmetric. Female mitochondrial diversity does not show the same pattern at the same time. Male lineages narrowed sharply during a period that overlaps, with remarkable proximity, to the window in which ancient Mesopotamian flood narratives were being written down. The cause of this male-specific compression is debated. Some researchers attribute it to violent conflict between competing patrilineal groups. Others point to founder effects in rapidly expanding agricultural societies. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence does not resolve cleanly to any single cause. What it does, at minimum, is demonstrate that something real was happening to human male lineages in the ancient Near East during exactly the period the biblical text was trying to describe. The story was not being told in a genetic vacuum. Return now to the structure of the Genesis account itself, because there is a detail in it that receives surprisingly little attention and which becomes significantly more interesting in light of everything the genetics reveals. The story does not begin with the flood. It begins with a description of why the flood happened, and that description is not primarily about water. It is about wickedness. It is about a world so thoroughly corrupted that the only remedy was erasure and reconstruction. The theological language is doing something that the scientific framework is not equipped to evaluate. But the structure of the claim, that a particular set of moral and behavioral conditions had brought the world to a crisis point that required catastrophic resolution, is not a structure entirely foreign to how ecologists and anthropologists think about the conditions preceding population collapses. It is not a scientific statement, but it is not entirely disconnected from the way catastrophes actually work. Communities that overexploit their environment, that exhaust their resources, that enter into the kinds of internal conflicts that escalate beyond resolution, do collapse. The mechanisms are different, the language describing them is different, but the underlying pattern of a civilization reaching the edge of what it can sustain and going over that edge catastrophically is one that the archaeological record documents across human history. What Genesis describes, at its most stripped-down structural level, is exactly that. A world that reached an unsustainable point, a catastrophic reset, a tiny surviving group carrying within themselves everything necessary to begin again. And from the outside, from the perspective of the people who survived it, the explanation for why it happened would not have been a geological survey of ice melt and hydrology. It would have been a reckoning. The question of whose reckoning it was is a theological one. The fact that a reckoning of some kind happened is not. There is one more thread here that deserves to be followed, and it is perhaps the strangest one. The ancient DNA evidence that has been reshaping our understanding of human prehistory has not stopped at identifying bottlenecks and founding populations. It has also, in recent years, been revealing something about the people of the ancient Near East that sits uncomfortably with any simple picture of the region's history. Studies of ancient genomes from Mesopotamia, from the Levant, from the Caucasus, have consistently revealed deep layers of genetic mixing. Populations that appeared from archaeology alone to be relatively stable turned out to be genetically the product of multiple waves of migration and replacement. People moved across the ancient Near East in patterns that were far more complex and far more dramatic than the settlements they left behind would suggest. Some of these movements correlate with climate events. Some correlate with the appearance and disappearance of specific archaeological cultures. And some of them, positioned in the right time window, in the right geography, correlate with the kind of sudden catastrophic disruption that a major regional flood would cause. The genetic signal of a displaced and dispersed population, people moving rapidly away from a flooded region and mixing with the populations they encountered, looks like exactly what the ancient Near Eastern DNA record contains. Not a definitive signature, not a labeled event, but a pattern consistent with exactly the kind of demographic upheaval the Genesis narrative describes. The honest conclusion is not that science has proven the Bible right. Science does not do that and is not equipped to do that. The honest conclusion is considerably more interesting. The honest conclusion is that when you take the Genesis account of a catastrophic survival event seriously as a description of something that actually happened, and then look at what genetics and geology and archaeology have independently discovered about the deep history of the human species in the region, the text describes the overlaps are not the overlaps of coincidence. The structure of the human genome contains the fingerprint of at least one catastrophic population reduction, so severe that nearly every human being on Earth was wiped out. The sediment cores at the bottom of the Black Sea contain the physical record of a regional catastrophe that would have destroyed every human settlement within the range of its reach. The ancient DNA of the Mesopotamian region contains signatures of sudden dispersal and population mixing consistent with the aftermath of exactly such an event. The oldest flood narratives in the written record predate the Genesis text and share its essential structure, because they were all drawing from the same surviving memory of the same event. And then there is Noah himself, not the Sunday school figure in a picture book surrounded by cartoon giraffes. The person the text actually describes, a man who was warned in advance, who was considered righteous in the language and framework of his time, who built something designed to survive what was coming, who waited through the catastrophe and emerged on the other side as a founder. The genetics of every living human being traces back to exactly that kind of figure. Not a cartoon, a survivor, a man, or a lineage of people on whom the entire subsequent history of our species depends. The genome says so. The deep past says so. The story has been telling us so for thousands of years. What the DNA reveals is not a miracle in the sense that the word is sometimes used to dismiss further inquiry. It reveals something more unsettling than a miracle. It reveals a convergence. Ancient stories written by people with no access to population genetics, no knowledge of mitochondrial haplogroups, no tools more sophisticated than clay and reed and memory, and modern science equipped with genome sequences and computational models powerful enough to reconstruct the population size of human ancestors 1 million years ago. They arrive by entirely different routes at the same place, a catastrophic narrowing, a tiny surviving group, a world rebuilt from almost nothing. That convergence does not require a theological conclusion, but it absolutely refuses to be explained away. The waters rose. Something survived. The rest of us are why. One question before you go, and I genuinely want to know what you think. After everything in this video, do you believe the flood in Genesis was a real historical event, a memory of something that actually happened, or a story that was never meant to be taken literally? Leave your answer in the comments. There is no wrong answer here, and the conversation down there is always worth reading.